They kept dumping their snow on my land like I was invisible, like my fence didn't matter, like I didn't matter. I asked, I warned. I even showed them the maps, the flood lines, the truth. They laughed, said it was just snow. So I built a wall, 10 feet tall, cold, silent, immovable. And when the blizzard came, that wall stood, but their side collapsed. Her garage caved in under the very snow she forced onto me. They tried to blame me, sue me, break me. But the truth doesn't melt under pressure. It freezes, it remembers. And when it finally thaws, it exposes everything. The first snowstorm of the season descended on Ridgepoint Valley, like a heavy curtain muffling every sound, except the soft crunch of boots on fresh powder. For Victor Hallen, that silence had always carried a double edge. It promised peace, but it also whispered of danger. 20 years spent measuring avalanche risks on Colorado's high ridges had taught him that snow could be deceptive, gentle one moment, catastrophic the next. He had left that life behind, trading icy ridgelines and emergency alerts for a quiet house on the valley's edge. Or so he had hoped. He had bought the modest home 2 years earlier after his wife Sarah slipped away in the dead of another winter. The grief had carved something hollow inside him, and Ellie, then 13, needed roots that didn't shift with every storm. Ridgepoint Valley seemed ideal. A small cluster of homes tucked among tall pines, clean roads, maintained by the Homeowners Association, and just enough distance from Denver's clamor to feel separate from the world. Victor was halfway through his morning coffee, the kitchen warm with the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace, when the low growl of a snowplow rolled up the street. He stepped outside, breath clouding in the sharp air, and watched as the machine scraped the shared road clean. The plow driver, a young man in an oversized parka, with the HOA logo stitched crookedly on the back, worked methodically. Victor didn't think much of it until he reached the mailbox and saw what had happened. A massive heap of snow had been dumped squarely onto the eastern edge of his property. Not a casual spillover, but a deliberate pile 15 feet long, nearly waist-high, burying the orange fiberglass markers he had driven into the ground himself the previous fall. He knelt, brushing away the top layer until he found one of the rods bent and cracked like a broken promise. Victor's gaze followed the plow's trail straight to the end of the cul-de-sac. Karen Langley stood there, hands on her hips, a bright red scarf knotted tightly at her throat. She was speaking to the driver, gesturing with the authority of someone who had never been questioned. Karen had been Ridgepoint's HOA treasurer for 3 years, and more recently the self-appointed snow czar. She ran winter operations with a zeal that bordered on obsession. Victor walked over slowly, keeping his voice even. "Morning," he said. "Looks like the plow dropped more than intended on my side." Karen turned, her expression tightening into that familiar pinched smile. "Victor Hallen, correct. That's right. The snow has to go somewhere," she replied smoothly. "We're keeping the roads clear, safety first." Victor nodded once. "I'm all for clear roads, but that pile is on my land." Her smile didn't waver. "I'll make a note of it, but it's just snow, Victor. It'll melt." He felt the old instinct rise to explain how compacted snow could alter drainage, create runoff, saturate soil, or even increase pressure on slopes. He had seen entire neighborhoods damaged by exactly this kind of temporary storage. But he swallowed the lecture. He wasn't here to teach. "Just don't let it happen again," he said quietly. Karen's smile faltered for a heartbeat. "I'll see what I can do." He turned and walked back to his house boots, leaving deep prints in the undisturbed snow. Inside, Ellie had already left for her volunteer shift at the rec center. The house felt too quiet, without her footsteps overhead. Victor stood at the kitchen window, staring at the new drift that now marked the boundary between his yard and the road. It wasn't just snow. It was the first crack in the stillness he had come here to find. That afternoon, he took out his old field notebook, the one he hadn't touched since retirement, and began jotting down measurements, length of the pile depth, approximate weight. He snapped photos with his phone, time-stamped them, and marked the GPS coordinates of each boundary rod. Years of government work had taught him one thing above all: document everything. He wasn't planning a fight. Not yet. But something in the way Karen had looked at him, cool, dismissive, certain, stirred an old memory. He thought of Sarah, how she used to tease him about his mountain man habits, the way he could read a slope like a book. He missed her voice in the quiet moments like this. Outside, the plow had moved on, leaving behind a clean road and a new line drawn in white. Victor closed the notebook and looked out at the valley. The pines stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with fresh snow. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the tension that came when a storm was building and no one else could see it coming. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of frost and friction. Storm after storm swept down from the northwest, blanketing Ridgepoint Valley in thick layers of powder. Each time the HOA contracted plow rumbled through the neighborhood, Victor watched from his kitchen window, coffee cooling untouched in his hand. And each time, without fail, the blade lifted at the end of the cul-de-sac and unloaded its burden directly onto his eastern fence line. The second dump came 2 mornings later. Victor was outside clearing his driveway when the familiar growl echoed up the street. He stopped shoveling and stared as the plow pushed a fresh avalanche of compacted ice straight over his boundary markers. This pile was taller, denser, hard-packed from the road surface and laced with gravel. It buried the split-rail fence up to the second beam and pressed against the cedar siding of his tool shed like a slow-moving glacier. Ellie came out onto the porch in her coat and boots, cheeks flushed from sleep. "Dad, they did it again." Victor only nodded. He didn't trust his voice yet. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began filming the plow's path, the driver's hesitant glance toward Karen's house, the way she stood on her porch, watching with arms folded as though supervising a routine delivery. By the third incident a week later, after a heavier overnight fall, the eastern edge of his yard had become a jagged ridge of man-made drifts. The snow there no longer looked soft. It had hardened into blue-tinted ice, heavy enough to splinter one of the fence posts clean through. Water from the initial melt had seeped into the soil beneath, freezing again at night, and heaving the ground in uneven plates. That evening, Ellie sat at the kitchen table doing homework, while Victor spread his old topographic maps across the counter. The paper smelled faintly of pine and cold storage. He traced the contour lines with a finger, noting how the gentle slope from the clubhouse down to his lot could channel runoff in dangerous ways if the weight kept building. "Are we going to say something?" Ellie asked, quietly, closing her textbook. "I already did," Victor replied. His voice sounded distant, even to himself. "She said it would melt." Ellie frowned. "It's not melting fast enough. And it's ruining the yard." Victor looked at his daughter, 16, now taller than her mother had been, with the same thoughtful gray eyes. Sarah used to sit in that same chair grading papers late into the night while he pored over avalanche reports. The memory stung sharp and sudden. He cleared his throat. "I'm handling it," he told her. "I promise." Handling it meant documentation. Every morning after a storm, Victor walked the perimeter with a collapsible snow probe and a laser level. He measured depth, density, temperature gradients. He set up a discrete trail camera behind the pine shed, angled to capture the plow's movements. Each evening, he downloaded the footage, logged timestamps, and compared them against the HOA's published snow removal schedule, which of course contained no mention of using private property as a storage site. He wasn't angry yet. Anger required energy he wasn't ready to spend. What he felt was a colder, more familiar sensation, the slow accumulation of pressure, the way a snowpack builds layer upon layer until the weakest interface finally gives. Subtle signs began appearing in the mailbox. Glossy HOA newsletters emphasizing community cooperation during winter operations. An email blast reminding residents to respect shared snow efforts and avoid unnecessary complaints. At the Saturday community potluck in the clubhouse, Karen stood at the podium and spoke at length about the spirit of communal sacrifice, her gaze sliding across Victor as though daring him to speak. He didn't. He simply refilled his coffee and left early. That night, unable to sleep, he pulled out the thick binder of Ridgepoint Valley covenants he'd received at closing. Most homeowners skimmed them once and forgot. Victor read every section like a structural engineer reviewing load limits. Deep in the landscaping and maintenance rules, Section 6.4 stood out in black and white. No snow or storm debris shall be deposited upon private lots without express owner consent, unless said deposition falls under emergency mitigation, as declared by county officials. No emergency had been declared. No consent had been given. Victor closed the binder and stared at the ceiling. Outside, wind rattled the pines, and another light flurry whispered against the windows. He thought of Sarah again, how she would have laughed at the absurdity, then marched straight to Karen's door with a plate of cookies and a steel spine. He missed that fire in his life. The next morning brought the heaviest dump yet. Victor heard the plow before he saw it, the engine straining under its load. He stepped outside in time to watch the blade tilt and release a cascading wall of ice chunks directly against his shed. The impact shuddered through the wooden walls. A shelf inside rattled, and he heard something glass break. Ellie appeared beside him, pulling on gloves. "That's enough," she said, voice trembling with teenage certainty. "We have to do something." Victor looked at the new mountain of frost, now blocking half the side yard, then at his daughter's determined face. Something shifted inside him. Not rage, but resolve. The way a cornice finally detaches from a ridge after weeks of silent strain. "We will," he said, "but not the way they expect." He spent the rest of the day in the garage, pulling out equipment he hadn't touched in years. Plywood forms, a handheld ice auger, lengths of rebar, his old compaction tamper. Tools of a former life. Tools that knew how to shape snow instead of merely moving it. Ellie watched from the doorway, breath fogging in the cold air. "What are you planning, Dad?" Victor tested the weight of a plank, feeling the familiar balance in his hands. "I'm going to give them a boundary they can't ignore," he said. Outside, the drifts continued to rise, silent and relentless. But inside Victor, something else was rising too. A quiet, steady certainty that this quiet valley had chosen the wrong mountain to test. The idea took shape slowly, the way a cornice builds on a wind-loaded ridge, one layer at a time, deliberate and patient. Victor began the morning after the heaviest dump, when the air hung so cold it burned the lungs. Ellie was still asleep. The house was quiet, except for the soft tick of the wood stove settling. He pulled on his old insulated coveralls, the ones stained with years of glacier dust and pine pitch, and stepped into the garage. The tools were exactly where he had left them: plywood sheets for forms, a coil of nylon rope, the handheld water pump he once used to flood test snow bridges. Everything waited like old allies. He started at the eastern fence line, where the HOA's latest gift rose in a chaotic mound of scraped ice and road grit. Instead of shoveling it away, Victor began to reshape it. He cut rectangular blocks with a snow saw, stacked them in staggered rows, and tamped each layer with the flat of a shovel until the crystals locked together. Between courses, he poured thin streams of water from a garden hose, letting the night frost weld them into something harder than nature intended. Ellie found him there at midday, cheeks red from the wind, a thermos of hot chocolate in her mittened hands. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Building a boundary," he said without pausing. She watched him work for a long minute, breath fogging in rhythmic clouds. "It looks like a fortress." Victor paused, leaning on the shovel handle. The structure was already shoulder high, its face sloping gently outward for stability. Moonlight from the night before had glazed the surface with a thin armor of ice that caught the weak winter sun like dull glass. "That's exactly what it is," he said. By the third day, the barrier stood 8 feet tall and ran the full length of the eastern lot line, a clean, pale monolith rising from the yard like a frozen rampart. Victor had carved subtle drainage channels along the base to guide any meltwater harmlessly downhill, and he'd reinforced the core with rebar driven deep into the frozen ground. It wasn't merely piled snow anymore. It was engineered, load-bearing, beautiful in its severity. Ellie dubbed it the Great Divide one evening as they stood together admiring the finished height. 10 feet now, cresting just above the top rail of what remained of their fence. From the street, it looked impossible, smooth, seamless, gleaming under the porch lights of passing neighbors. Word traveled fast in Ridge Point Valley. Cars slowed as they passed. Some drivers offered cautious thumbs up through frosted windows. Children on sleds stared open-mouthed from the opposite sidewalk. Mr. Shapiro, the retired dentist, 3 houses down, paused during his evening walk and called out, "That's quite the sculpture, Victor." Victor waved back without smiling. He wasn't building for applause. Karen Langley's reaction was predictably less appreciative. She appeared on her porch the afternoon the barrier reached its full height, arms crossed beneath her red scarf, staring across the cul-de-sac, as though the structure had personally insulted her. Victor was on a ladder, adding a final ice glaze to the crest when he noticed her. He lifted a hand in greeting. She did not return it. That same night, an email arrived from the HOA signed by Karen in her capacity as treasurer. "Dear residents, while we appreciate individual efforts during challenging winter conditions, please be reminded that unapproved structures, temporary or otherwise may interfere with snow dispersal emergency access or neighborhood aesthetic standards. The board will review any recent constructions and may require modification or removal if found non-compliant. Thank you for your continued cooperation. Karen Langley, Treasurer. Victor read it twice, then forwarded it to the growing folder on his laptop labeled Documentation. He almost smiled. Unsafe. He had slope calculations, compaction tests, and shear strength estimates that would make a civil engineer proud. The barrier was stronger than most retaining walls in the valley. Ellie read the message over his shoulder. They're scared of a wall made of snow. They're scared of anything they can't control, he replied. Later, as the temperature plunged again and fresh flakes began to drift from a steel-gray sky, Victor stood at the base of the rampart and ran a gloved hand along its frozen face rose. It hummed faintly under his touch, the low, resonant note of dense ice under pressure. He thought of Sarah again, how she would have stood right here beside him laughing at the sheer audacity of it all. You turned their trash into a castle, she would have said. He looked up at the smooth crest silhouetted against the night sky. Somewhere beyond it, Karen's porch light glowed like a watchful eye. The valley lay hushed under another layer of fresh powder, and the wind carried the clean metallic scent of deep cold. Victor exhaled slowly, watching his breath rise and vanish. They had drawn first blood, pushing their refuse onto his land again and again. Now he had answered not with words, not with lawyers, but with something solid and undeniable. The Great Divide stood between them, silent and immense, catching every new flake that fell. And for the first time since moving to Ridgepoint Valley, Victor felt the ground beneath his feet feel truly his own. The clubhouse smelled of cinnamon cider and fresh pine garland when Victor walked in that evening. Fairy lights twinkled along the rafters, and folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a plywood podium someone had draped with a burgundy tablecloth. It was the monthly open forum, the one meeting Victor had avoided since moving in. Tonight he carried a slim black binder under his arm and wore the calm expression he once reserved for testifying before federal safety panels. Ellie had watched him zip up his coat with a mixture of worry and pride. You sure you don't want me to come? This part's mine, he told her. You hold the fort. He arrived early and took a seat near the back, unnoticed among the clusters of neighbors chatting over paper cups. Karen Langley stood at the front clipboard in hand curls, perfect smile, practiced. She wore a forest green sweater that somehow made her look both festive and formidable. The meeting began with routine announcements, budget updates, the spring gardening initiative, a reminder about holiday decoration takedown dates. Then Karen cleared her throat and shifted into the segment she had clearly rehearsed. Finally, she said, voice carrying easily over the low murmur, we need to address a matter of community standards. As many of you have noticed, a large snow structure has recently appeared on one of our private lots. While we applaud creativity and winter spirit, unapproved constructions, even temporary ones, can obstruct emergency access routes, disrupt snow dispersal, and affect the overall aesthetic harmony of Ridgepoint Valley. A few heads turned. Whispers rippled outward like rings on a pond. Karen continued louder now. Ridgepoint is a community, not a collection of individual fortresses. We all share responsibility for maintaining the beauty and safety we chose when we moved here. A nervous chuckle escaped someone near the front. Victor stood. The room quieted so completely that the hum of the heater became audible. Karen's eyes flicked to him, surprise flickering across her face, before the mask slid back into place. Victor, she said, syrupy, and loud enough for everyone to hear. Did you have a comment? He walked forward without hurry, boots quiet on the carpet runner. When he reached the front, he didn't take the podium. He simply turned to face the residents. I built the barrier, he said, voice steady and carrying. And I built it because for the past 4 weeks, the HOA contracted plow, under Karen's direct supervision, has been dumping road snow onto my private property. A collective intake of breath. Someone shifted in a metal chair. The squeak sounded unnaturally loud. Victor opened the binder. I have time-stamped video from a trail camera. I have GPS coordinates of every boundary marker that's now buried. I have photographs showing the same plow making multiple passes along my fence line, while other driveways went uncleared. And I have Section 6.4 of our own covenants, which states clearly that no snow shall be deposited on private lots without owner consent or county-declared emergency. He held up a printed page for the room to see. There has been no emergency declaration. There has been no consent. Karen stepped forward, hand raised like a traffic cop. Victor, this is not the appropriate. Please let me finish, he said, not sharply, but with the quiet authority that once silenced crowded briefing rooms before avalanche evacuations. The room granted it to him. When I first raised the concern politely, I was told it was an oversight. When it happened again and again, I was sent emails about communal sacrifice. When part of my fence was destroyed under the weight, I was threatened with fines for protecting my own land. He paused, letting the words settle. So yes, I built a 10-foot barrier. Out of the very snow you delivered to my yard. It's engineered to hold. It channels meltwater safely. And it marks a boundary you kept pretending didn't exist. Karen's cheeks flushed crimson against the green sweater. You're making serious accusations. They're documented, Victor replied. Not accusations, facts. A voice from the middle row broke the silence. Dave lived across the circle, always walked his labradoodle at dusk, spoke up. I've seen it too. The plow looped past Victor's place twice one morning while my driveway was still buried. A woman near the cider table nodded. Same here. Thought I was imagining it. Karen gripped her clipboard tighter. Even if there were scheduling adjustments, that does not justify erecting an unauthorized eyesore that blocks sightlines, and it's snow, Victor cut in gently. Temporary, like your respect for property lines turned out to be. A few involuntary laughs escaped. Someone coughed to cover it. Karen glanced at the board members seated behind her. They looked suddenly fascinated by their shoes. She recovered enough to say, the board will review this matter thoroughly. Meeting adjourned. Chairs scraped as people rose, but no one moved toward the exit right away. Conversation started in low, animated clusters. Victor felt eyes on him, curious, sympathetic, wary. He closed the binder and walked back down the aisle. At the door, Mr. Shapiro caught his sleeve. Good on you, son. About time someone read her the fine print. Victor only nodded and stepped into the night. The cold hit him like a cleansing breath. Fresh flakes drifted under the street lamps, soft and directionless. He paused on the clubhouse steps, looking across the darkened valley toward home. The Great Divide would be standing there catching this new snow, glowing faintly under moonlight. For the first time in weeks, the plow did not come the next morning. Victor stood at the window with his coffee and watched the street remain untouched along his boundary. The silence felt different now, charged, expectant. He knew it wasn't surrender. Karen didn't surrender. But the ground had shifted, and the snow patient as ever kept falling. The thaw came slyly disguised as mercy. One February morning, the temperature crept above freezing for the first time in weeks. Sunlight struck the Great Divide and turned its surface into a sheet of diamonds, water weeping in slow rivulets down the sculpted face. Victor stood on the porch with his coffee, watching the droplets fall in steady rhythm. He had designed those channels himself. The runoff ran harmlessly along the base and away from the house, soaking into the pine needles at the edge of the yard. Across the property line, however, the story was different. The massive banks the HOA had piled over weeks, uncompacted, unengineered, began to sag. Dark patches appeared where meltwater soaked through, and the weight pressed harder against Karen's low, retaining wall behind her detached garage. Victor noticed the change immediately. A hairline crack zigzagging across the concrete blocks, water seeping out like blood from a fresh wound. He had seen this before, too many times. In Telluride, in Crested Butte, in every mountain town that forgot snow had memory. Rapid melt after deep freeze turned dense packs into slush bombs. Gravity did the rest. That afternoon, he spread his old avalanche overlays across the kitchen table again. Ellie helped him pin the translucent sheets over the current Ridgepoint plat map. The historical slide path, a wet slab event from the 1970s, ran directly beneath the eastern cul-de-sac. The clubhouse sat at the top of the gentle bluff. His lot lay midway down the slope. Karen's garage anchored the bottom edge. All the snow she had pushed onto his side now rested on the uphill face of her own foundation. Victor circled the danger zone in red, then scanned the pages into a single PDF. He attached slope calculations, compaction readings from his problogs, and a short cover letter written in the measured language of a professional risk assessment. He walked the packet across the frozen street himself. Karen answered the door in yoga pants and a fleece vest, hair pulled back, surprise flickering across her face when she saw him. I'm not here to argue, Victor said, extending the folder. I'm here to inform. She took it automatically, glancing at the thick stack as though it might bite. This is a courtesy, he continued. A professional evaluation of the snow load you've placed against that retaining wall. If we get another hard freeze followed by rapid warming, and the forecast says the pressure could exceed the wall's shear strength, I've included mitigation recommendations. Karen's eyes narrowed. You're threatening me now. No, I'm warning you. There's a difference. He turned and left her standing in the doorway, the packet clutched against her chest. The next day brought the hard freeze he had predicted. Temperatures plummeted to single digits overnight. Water that had seeped into cracks expanded, widening fractures. Victor heard the faint pop and groan of ice from across the line as he lay awake in the dark. By midweek, the warm front returned stronger this time. Daytime highs climbed into the 40s. Icicles lengthened like spears along every eave. The Great Divide wept steadily, its channels carrying clear streams downhill. But the HOA banks, denser now from refreezing, began to lean ominously toward Karen's garage. Victor checked the slope daily, driving his probe into the base of the pile and noting the rising water saturation. At night, the woods behind the houses echoed with strange noises, muffled cracks, the slow grind of settling mass. Ellie woke him once at 3 a.m., voice small in the darkness. Dad, it sounds like something's moving out there. They stood together at the bedroom window, breath fogging the glass. Moonlight silvered the yard, turning the rampart into a glowing cliff. Beyond it, the darker mass of the HOA snow loomed, its surface unnaturally smooth and bulging. It's settling, Victor said quietly, getting ready. For what? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rested a hand on her shoulder, feeling how much taller she had grown this winter. For whatever comes next. The following Friday, county vehicles appeared on the street, 2 white trucks with the planning and safety logo on the doors. Victor had called them the day after delivering his report to Karen, requesting a routine winter integrity survey based on historical slide data and recent activity. He had not mentioned names. He had simply cited the coordinates. The inspectors spent the morning measuring, probing, taking photographs. One of them, a wiry woman named Deidre, knocked on Victor's door in the afternoon. You're the one who filed the request, she asked, glancing at the towering barrier with professional curiosity. I am. Mind if we take a closer look at this structure? Victor led her around the side yard. She ran a gloved hand along the ice-glazed face, tapped it with a small hammer, checked the drainage channels. This is impressive work, she said. Military-grade retention almost. You an engineer? Former avalanche forecaster, State Control Division. She nodded, making notes. Your wall's the only thing keeping that upslope load from migrating farther downhill. Without it, we'd already be looking at basement flooding lower on the cul-de-sac. Victor said nothing. Deidre glanced toward Karen's property, where the retaining wall now showed a visible bow in the center. We'll be recommending immediate removal of the unauthorized stockpile and a formal review of HOA snow management practices. She handed him her card. If anything changes overnight, call me directly. That evening, Victor stood at the base of the rampart, again listening to the soft drip of meltwater and the deeper, more ominous creaks from across the line. The air smelled of pine and wet earth spring, trying to force its way through winter's grip. He thought of Sarah, how she used to say mountains never hurried. They simply waited until the balance tipped. Somewhere in the dark, ice shifted with a sound like distant thunder. The balance was tipping, and the snow-patient relentless remembered every layer it had been forced to carry. The morning sun broke over the ridge in a blaze of pale gold, turning every surface into a mirror of light and shadow. Victor was in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, when the rumble started low at first, like distant thunder trapped under the earth. He knew the sound before he saw it. A full-size yellow bulldozer, treads churning through the slushy street, rolled slowly toward his yard. Beside the cab stood Karen Langley, arms crossed, face set in rigid determination. The driver wore a neon safety vest and looked barely old enough to operate heavy machinery. Victor set the mug down hard enough to slosh coffee over the rim and strode outside without a coat. The cold bit his skin, but adrenaline burned hotter. "Stop!" he shouted, waving both arms as he crossed the yard. "Stop right there." The machine ground to a halt, mere feet from the base of the Great Divide. Karen stepped forward, boots crunching on ice crust. "Mr. Hallen," she said, voice clipped and official. You've been notified multiple times to remove this obstruction. You've refused. The HOA is now exercising its authority to clear the hazard. She held up a plastic sleeve document already speckled with melt droplets. Emergency clearance authorization. Your structure is impounding snow and creating a flooding risk to the entire community. Victor's pulse hammered in his ears. That's not a hazard. That's the only thing preventing a flood. Look at your own garage, Karen. That crack in the foundation, it's from the weight you dumped uphill of it. She smiled thinly. Your wall is the bottleneck. The driver leaned out of the cab, uncertain. Ma'am, you sure about this? That thing looks pretty solid. Proceed, Karen snapped. Victor stepped directly in front of the blade. Touch this wall and you'll be answering to the county. I filed a formal risk assessment. Inspectors are scheduled here this morning. For the first time, Karen's composure cracked. I don't believe you. Suit yourself. They'll be here within the hour. She hesitated, eyes flicking to the rampart's gleaming face, then to her own sagging retaining wall visible just beyond. The driver killed the engine. The sudden silence felt deafening. Karen pulled out her phone, turning away to make a call. Victor stood, his ground breath clouding in furious bursts. It could have ended in standoff. But the mountain had its own schedule. A sharp, explosive crack split the air like a rifle shot echoing off the pines. Then came the deeper groan, the wet grinding of tons shifting all at once. Victor spun toward the sound. Across the property line, the entire uphill face of the HOA snowbank let go. It began with a diagonal fracture racing across the retaining wall, concrete blocks bowing outward. Then the saturated mass behind it surged forward in a slow, unstoppable wave of slush and ice chunks. The wall exploded in a roar of splintering wood and crashing masonry. Thousands of pounds of melt-heavy snow poured through the breach, flooding into Karen's garage in a muddy torrent. Tools, bicycles, holiday bins, stacks of HOA files, everything disappeared under the deluge. The rear garage door buckled and blew outward. The roof sagged dangerously in the center rafters, creaking like breaking bones. Karen screamed a raw, involuntary sound that cut straight through the morning quiet. She stumbled backward, phone slipping from her fingers into the snow. The bulldozer driver leapt from the cab and backed away, eyes wide. Victor remained where he was, boots planted on his side of the line, watching nature deliver the verdict he had tried to prevent. Water and debris spread across Karen's driveway in a widening fan, steaming faintly in the cold air. The smell of wet earth and crushed pine filled the neighborhood. Karen turned to Victor, face drained of color. You did this. No, he said quietly. You did. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Someone else had already called it in. Neighbors emerged onto porches, in robes and boots, staring at the wreckage. Victor looked once more at the Great Divide. It stood untouched, its engineered face shedding water calmly through the channels he had carved. Not a single crack marred its surface. It had held the back pressure exactly as designed, protecting everything downhill, including the lower homes she had claimed to fear for. County trucks arrived 20 minutes later. Deidre, the lead inspector, stepped out with her team and surveyed the scene in silence. She walked the debris field, took measurements, photographed the failed retaining wall and the clear demarcation where Victor's barrier had stopped the slide. When she crossed into his yard, she studied the rampart up close. This held the load, she said almost to herself, perfectly. Victor nodded. She turned to Karen, who stood shivering beside the ruined garage. Ma'am, we'll need all your snow management logs and contracts, immediately. Karen tried one last time. His wall caused the back pressure. No, Deidre interrupted firmly. Your unpermitted stockpiling on private property caused the failure. This structure mitigated it. She handed Victor a new form. We're upgrading your temporary permit to official seasonal retention status. No one touches it until spring thaw. Karen stared at the paperwork as though it were written in another language. By evening, temporary barricades ringed the collapsed garage. Insurance adjusters came and went, shaking their heads. Word spread quickly, preliminary denial, citing preventable overload and non-compliant storage. Victor stood on his porch long after sunset, watching moonlight glaze the intact rampart. It rose serene and luminous, catching stray flakes from a passing cloud. Ellie joined him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. You okay? She asked. He exhaled slowly. I tried to warn her. I know. In the quiet that followed, they listened to the soft, steady drip of water, From the divide's channels, the sound of something engineered enduring, while something careless crumbled. The snow had spoken, and for once, everyone had heard it. News of the collapse spread through Ridgepoint Valley faster than meltwater down a gutter. By midday, the cul-de-sac hummed with quiet activity, neighbors gathering in small knots on driveways, phones out, voices low. No one pointed fingers aloud, but eyes kept drifting toward the sagging ruin of Karen's garage, and then upward to the serene, unbroken face of the Great Divide. Victor stayed inside most of the day, letting the county team finish their work. Deidre returned in the afternoon with a finalized report. She knocked once, then stepped onto the porch when he opened the door. "Just wanted to update you personally," she said, handing over a clipboard for signature. "We've issued a formal cease and desist on any further snow storage along private boundaries. The HOA will be required to submit a corrected winter operations plan within 14 days, complete with GPS-tracked routes and volume logs." Victor signed without comment. Deidre glanced at the rampart again, admiration clear in her eyes. "This structure of yours saved at least 2 basements downhill from flooding. Might want to think about patenting the design." He gave a small, tired smile. "It's just old avalanche retention technique scaled down." "Well, it worked." She paused, then added more quietly. "And for what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to go through this to prove a point." After she left, Victor filed the new permit in his binder. Then he did something he hadn't done since the beginning. He applied for official recognition of the barrier as a temporary seasonal snow retention structure under county winter allowances. The form was rarely used, mostly by farmers protecting orchards, but it fit. By evening, approval came back via email, complete with a permit number and a small laminated tag he could post on a stake. He drove the stake into the frozen ground at the base of the rampart the next morning. The tag fluttered gently in the breeze visible from the street permit, Mabra WR 2026-007, authorized seasonal retention barrier. Let them try to touch it now. Neighbors began stopping by in ones and twos, not to gawk at the wreckage across the way, but to stand at the edge of Victor's yard and study the towering ice wall with something like reverence. Mr. Shapiro arrived, first thermos in hand again. This time it held strong coffee laced with whiskey. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Should have spoken up sooner. We all saw the plow favoring certain driveways. Just didn't think it would come to this." Victor accepted the thermos and took a warming sip. "You're speaking now." Shapiro nodded toward the permit tag. "Smart, real smart." Later, the couple from Maple Drive brought their young son, who stared up at the gleaming face with wide eyes. "It's like the wall from Game of Thrones," the boy whispered. His parents laughed nervously, then thanked Victor for keeping the water from reaching our basement. Even Dave, the Labradoodle owner, lingered one evening during his walk. "Herd insurance denied her claim outright," he said. "Something about preventable overload due to non-compliant storage practices." Victor only nodded. Word was Karen had been forced to vacate the garage entirely. Structural engineers deemed it unsafe. Demolition was scheduled once the ground thawed enough for heavy equipment. She moved boxes herself on the weekends, face-pale lips pressed thin. She never looked toward Victor's yard while she worked. Inside the house, life settled into an unfamiliar calm. Ellie seemed to stand taller, her laughter coming more easily. One night, she helped Victor reinforce the rampart further, adding a final misting of water that froze into a crystal-clear sheath under the moonlight. They worked side by side in silence, breath clouding the only sound, the soft hiss of the hose and the occasional creak of settling ice. When they finished, she stepped back and surveyed their work. "It's kinda beautiful, isn't it?" she said. Victor studied the smooth curves, the way starlight fractured across the surface. "It's functional," he replied. Then softer. "But yeah, it is." The HOA board convened an emergency closed session 2 nights later. Victor didn't attend. He didn't need to. The next morning, a new email arrived, this one signed by interim president James Downey, not Karen. It announced a pause on all enforcement actions related to seasonal snow structures and promised a forthcoming review of winter policies with resident input strongly encouraged. Victor archived the message and closed his laptop. Outside, fresh powder had fallen, overnight light and dry, the kind that catches on every ledge and crest. The Great Divide wore it like a mantle, rising higher and more majestic than ever. For the first time since Sarah's death, Victor felt something loosen in his chest. Not triumph, something quieter. The knowledge that he had drawn a line, and the mountain itself had honored it. He stood at the kitchen window with Ellie beside him, both of them watching the soft flakes drift down. It held, she said simply. He rested a hand on her shoulder. So did we. In the distance, the ruined garage sat cordoned off with yellow tape, a silent testament. And above it all, the rampart stood permitted, reinforced, unbowed, catching the new snow, as though it had always belonged there. Spring teased the valley with false promises, but winter clung on with a vindictive grip. Late February turned brutal again, clear skies by day, plunging temperatures by night. The Great Divide stood taller than ever, its surface hardened into translucent armor by repeated freeze-thaw cycles, catching every stray flake that drifted across the cul-de-sac. Then the certified letter arrived. Victor found the thick envelope propped against his front door one gray afternoon, no mailbox this time, hand-delivered. The return address read a law firm in downtown Breckenridge. Inside was a formal complaint filed on behalf of the Ridgepoint Valley HOA and personally signed by Karen Langley. They were suing him, not just for maintaining an unauthorized, permanent structure in violation of covenants, but for willful interference with HOA maintenance operations, resulting in material damage to community property and personal assets of Treasurer Karen Langley. In plain language, they wanted him to pay for her collapsed garage. Victor sat at the kitchen table and read the document twice, slowly. The accusations were creative, claiming his rampart had created artificial back pressure that triggered the slide. They demanded removal of the structure, reimbursement for repairs, and punitive fines. Ellie came in from school, dropped her backpack, and saw his face. "They're suing us," she asked, reading over his shoulder. "Trying to?" She sat down hard. "After everything, after the county said. People like Karen don't accept verdicts. They don't write," Victor said quietly. That night, he pulled his old leather briefcase from the closet, the one he'd carried to federal hearings years ago. He spread every piece of evidence across the dining table, permit approvals, trail camera footage, probe logs. Drone photos of the plow routes, the county inspection report, Deidre's cease and desist order. Then he called Marcus Avery. Marcus had retired from the state avalanche program the same year Victor did. They'd worked together on the spring thaw rebuild after a deadly slide near Silverton. When Victor explained the situation, Marcus laughed once, short and sharp. "Send me the whole file. I'll hand-deliver it to the regional compliance office myself. They owe me favors." Victor overnighted everything. 48 hours later, the county attorney's office called. "Mr. Hallen, we've reviewed your materials. We're intervening in the civil claim. The HOA's suit appears frivolous and potentially retaliatory. We're also expanding our inquiry into possible misuse of association funds, specifically the rental of unauthorized heavy equipment." In other words, the script had flipped. Still, Karen came in person one last time. It was early evening, the sky already bruising into dusk. Her silver Lexus pulled up at the curb, tires crunching on leftover ice. She walked the path to his door in thin heels, clutching a manila folder like a shield. Victor opened before she could knock. "I'm here with a settlement offer," she said without greeting. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were ringed with exhaustion. "Dismantle the wall by next Friday and withdraw your county complaints. We'll drop the lawsuit." Everyone walks away. Victor studied her for a long moment. The woman who once stood on porches issuing edicts now looked smaller coat, buttoned to the throat against a wind that hadn't started yet. "You want me to admit fault for damage I warned you about," he said, "and tear down the only thing that kept it from being worse." Her jaw tightened. "You're escalating this into something expensive for both of us." "No, Karen. You already did that the first time you told the plow to bury my fence." She shifted her weight, glancing past him toward the rampart glowing faintly under the porch light. "You think you've won because the county backed you," she said, but these communities have long memories. Push too hard and... "I've seen what happens when people push too hard," Victor interrupted softly. "Garages collapse, basements flood. Sometimes whole villages disappear under slides no one wanted to believe were coming." He stepped forward and closed the door gently between them. Through the sidelight window, he watched her stand motionless for several seconds, breath clouding in the cold. Then she turned heels, clicking sharply down the path, tires spinning briefly on ice as she pulled away. The countersuit was filed the following week. Claire Forrester, his attorney, A woman who'd spent years representing homeowners against overreaching associations reviewed the evidence and smiled like someone opening a gift. "This won't survive summary judgment," she said. "But let's make sure they regret filing." They claim defamation, systematic property harassment, and abuse of HOA authority. They attached the county intervention, the cease and desist, and a detailed timeline of every plow dump. Within days, the phone began to ring. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now called with cautious questions. Did she really use HOA money to rent that bulldozer? Is it true the county's looking at the budget now? Think she'll lose her treasurer position? Victor answered honestly, but briefly. He didn't need to convince anyone anymore. The evidence was doing that work. Outside, fresh snow fell again, light dry crystals that settled on the rampart's crest like powdered sugar on a blade. Victor added one final layer of mist, one clear night turning the entire face into a seamless sheet of clear ice that reflected starlight like a dark mirror. Ellie stood beside him, hands in her pockets. "They thought a lawsuit would scare you quiet," she said. "They forgot who they were dealing with," Victor replied. She smiled, the first full, unguarded smile he'd seen from her in months. In the distance, Karen's house sat dark most evenings now. Word was the insurance adjuster had returned with a final denial. Demolition bids were coming in. The for sale sign hadn't appeared yet, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Victor didn't feel vindicated. He felt something closer to relief, the slow exhale, after holding your breath through a long, dangerous descent. The rampart stood permitted and reinforced, catching the new snow without complaint. And across the valley, the balance had finally irrevocably shifted. The blizzard warning came without mercy. Late February had fooled everyone with a few mild days, but Colorado mountains never forgive complacency. On a Tuesday morning, the emergency alert shrieked from both their phones, a high-impact storm barreling in from the northwest. 2 to 3 feet of snow, wind gusts to 60 miles per hour, near zero visibility. The kind of system that shuts highways and buries towns. Victor felt the old familiarity settle over him like a familiar coat. He and Ellie spent the day preparing the way he once prepped: remote forecast stations, roof cleared one final time, attic vents, sealed generator tested, and fueled sandbags stacked along the lower doors. The Great Divide loomed outside the kitchen window, its ice sheath gleaming under a darkening sky, channels already dripping in anticipation. By nightfall, the wind arrived, first a low moan rising to a howl that rattled windows and stripped loose snow from the pines. Power flickered twice, then died. Their generator kicked in smoothly. Lights stayed steady while the rest of the neighborhood plunged into darkness. They ate soup by lantern light and listened to the storm batter the house. Ellie fell asleep early, curled under extra blankets. Victor sat up, weather radio crackling with updates, roads closed, plows grounded, emergency crews delayed indefinitely. At dawn, the world outside was a white vortex. Victor shoveled a narrow path to the generator so as to keep the exhaust clear. The rampart stood serene in the chaos, catching the sideways-driven snow and building a graceful crest along its windward side. It looked almost alive, breathing in the storm and growing stronger. Mid-morning brought the knock. Victor opened the door to find James Downey on the porch, half buried in drifting powder scarf iced to his beard. "Victor," he shouted over the wind. "We need help." He explained in short bursts. Karen's pipes had frozen overnight. No generator, no heat. She'd been burning candles and a small propane heater until the tank ran dry. Phone dead. No one else had power or a way through the drift. "She won't last another night in that cold," James said. "And you're the only one I know who can get anywhere in this." Victor looked past him into the swirling white. The street had vanished. Only the tops of mailboxes marked where it used to be. He nodded once. Ellie appeared behind him, already pulling on her coat and boots. "I'm coming too." 20 minutes later, the three of them set out, Victor in the lead, with a long aluminum avalanche probe, as a staff Ellie and James roped together behind him with nylon cord. They moved in slow, deliberate steps, kicking through waist-deep drifts, heads bowed against the stinging gale. It took nearly an hour to cover what was normally a 3-minute walk. Karen's house emerged from the whiteout like a ghost, windows dark, chimney silent. Snow had piled to the top of her porch railing. Victor dug a trench to the door while Ellie and James shielded him from the wind. When the door finally opened, the rush of frigid air carried the smell of cold stone and fear. Karen stood wrapped in every coat she owned, face-pale lips tinged blue. She stared at Victor as though he were an apparition. "You," she whispered hoarsely. He didn't answer with words. He simply stepped inside, checked the thermostat, 38 degrees, and felt the walls radiating cold. Frost feathered the inside of the windows. Ellie handed Karen a thermos of hot tea from their pack. James helped her sit on the bottom stair. She drank in small, trembling sips, eyes never leaving Victor. They wrapped her in wool blankets and led her back out into the storm. The return journey was harder, Karen, slow and unsteady, but the rope held. Victor's path from the outbound trip had already begun to fill, but it was enough. Inside their warm house, at last, Karen sat by the wood stove, while color slowly returned to her face. Ellie made more tea. James called his wife on the landline to say he'd stay until the worst passed. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Karen looked at Victor across the flickering firelight. "I didn't think it would get this bad," she said, voice raw. Victor met her gaze. "You never do." She flinched, but didn't argue. Later, when the wind eased to a steady moan and the snow fell straight and heavy, Karen spoke again, quieter this time. "I was going to hire a new crew. After the investigation started the budget, everything got frozen. I thought we could wait it out." Victor poked the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "Snow doesn't wait," he said. Silence stretched again, broken only by the stove's soft crackle and the muffled howl outside. Karen wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. "I don't know how to thank you. After everything You don't have to," Victor cut in gently. "This is Colorado. In a storm like this, we don't keep score." Ellie glanced at her father, eyes shining with something like pride. That night, Karen slept in the guest room, bundled under quilts Sarah had chosen years ago. Victor sat up late listening to the storm rage and eventually tire itself out. He thought about boundaries of snow, of pride, of the thin line between enemy and neighbor when the mountain reminds you how small you are. Outside the Great Divide stood watch through the blizzard, catching every flake, holding the line, not out of spite anymore, but out of simple, unbreakable strength. And inside, for one long winter night, the house held more than it ever had before. The storm broke on Friday morning with the abruptness of a held breath finally released. One moment, the wind howled like something wild and wounded. The next, the world fell into crystalline silence. Sunlight poured over the ridge and struck the fresh blanket of snow, turning Ridgepoint Valley into a blinding sea of white. Victor stepped outside, first boots sinking to the ankle, in the light, dry powder that had fallen on top of the heavier base. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and cold, and every branch, every roofline, every fence post wore a thick cap of untouched frost. The Great Divide rose higher than ever, its crest sculpted into graceful wind-drifted curves, the permit tag still fluttering bravely at its base. Ellie joined him, scarf loose around her neck, eyes wide at the transformed landscape. "It's beautiful," she whispered, as though speaking too loudly might shatter it. Victor nodded. For the first time in months, the valley felt truly at peace. Across the street, Karen's house stood quiet. She had left the morning the plows finally reached them, thanked Ellie with a small awkward nod, thanked Victor with nothing more than a long look before walking back through the trenched path to her cold home. No one had seen her since. Spring arrived not with thunder, but with a slow, steady weeping. By mid-March, the days lengthened and warmed. The rampart began to melt from the top down, clear rivulets, tracing silver paths along its face, dripping steadily into the channels Victor had carved. Each morning, he and Ellie watched the transformation, the crest softening the walls, thinning the once imposing monolith, shrinking day by day. They never tried to stop it. One Saturday, in early April, Victor stood at the edge of what remained a low-rounded ridge of ice, no taller than his waist, and ran a gloved hand over the surface one last time. The texture had changed, completely granular now, almost sugary, giving way beneath the slightest pressure. Ellie brought out 2 lawn chairs and a thermos of coffee. They sat together in the warming sun and watched icicles lengthen and fall with soft plops into the grass below. "It did its job," Victor said quietly. "Better than its job," Ellie replied. "It changed everything." By the end of the month, the wall was gone entirely. All that marked its footprint was a faint green scar in the lawn, darker grass nourished by months of slow, rich melt. Ellie suggested flowers. Victor didn't argue. They planted tulips along the line, deep red and pure white bulbs tucked carefully into the thawed soil. Ellie chose the colors on purpose, something defiant and clean, she said. Word came in May that Karen had resigned from the HOA board. The official letter cited personal reasons and a desire for a fresh start. Rumor had it she'd accepted a job transfer somewhere warmer with less snow. The for sale sign appeared in her yard one quiet afternoon. It sold quickly. The new owners were a young family with 2 small kids and a golden retriever. They waved when they moved in. Victor waved back. The HOA changed too, not dramatically, but steadily. New guidelines were adopted: no private property, snow storage, mandatory GPS logging for all plow routes, public audits of winter budgets. A transparency committee formed. They asked Victor to chair it. He declined with a polite smile. He did, however, agree to one thing: a single winter preparation seminar for new residents each November. He stood in the clubhouse with his old maps and a simple slideshow teaching how to read slope angles, manage runoff, build safe retention if needed. People listened. Some took notes. A few thanked him afterward with genuine gratitude in their eyes. James Downey stopped by one June evening, dog leash in hand, pausing at the edge of the blooming tulips. "Quite the garden," he said. "Ellie's idea." He nodded toward the empty slab where Karen's garage had stood. Grass was already growing through the cracks. "She's gone for good," James said. "Left last week." Victor looked at the flowers' red and white petals opening to the evening light and felt no satisfaction, no bitterness, only the quiet certainty of something finished. "Good for her," he said. That summer, Ellie invited friends over without glancing nervously at the street first. She laughed louder, stayed out later, danced barefoot in the yard while Victor grilled dinner and watched from the porch. The hollow place Sarah's death had left began to fill, not with forgetting, but with living. One warm August evening, Victor found himself standing alone where the rampart once rose. The tulips had faded, but sturdy green shoots of perennials Ellie had added pushed through the soil. He knelt and pressed his fingers into the earth. It was rich, dark, alive. He thought of all the walls people build, some out of fear, some out of anger, some simply to hold back the weight of the world. His had been temporary by nature, permanent only in what it taught. Not every boundary needs to last forever. Some are meant to stand just long enough to protect what matters, then melt away, leaving stronger ground behind. Victor rose and walked back to the house. Inside, Ellie was playing music, something light and hopeful, drifting through the open windows. The valley lay golden in the setting sun, pines whispering in a gentle breeze. Another winter would come, as winters always do. But when it did, Victor knew he would be ready, not with resentment, but with knowledge. Not with isolation, but with the quiet strength of roots deepened by storm. Because the snow remembers, and so do we.